So to start off, I'd love to start my remarks with a question that means a lot to me. And the question that I want to share with you is, what is the world that you want to live in? What is the world that you want to live in? And I think it's a really powerful question as we start talking about the SDGs, because it reminds me that the work and the conversation that we're having today is inherently an act of science fiction. The work and conversation that we're talking about today is inherently a work of science fiction. And let's talk a little bit more about that, because I'm really drawn to science fiction, in particular the work of Octavia E. Butler, who shared that science fiction was so attractive because it was so wide open. There were no walls to hem her in. There was no human condition that she was stopped from examining. And as we begin to imagine a better, more sustainable, more equitable world, I think that in and of itself is science fiction. And in my eyes, this question invites you to embody what it means to be a science fiction writer. And this energy is really critical to my work and my approach to the SDGs. So I invite you to keep thinking about this question as I share a little bit about my story and my work. What is the world that you want to live in? So as a way of sharing a bit about my human bio and how I developed my passion for innovation and global engagement, I want to introduce you to my first science fiction writers, my mom and my dad. So my mom and dad are Taiwanese immigrants who came to the United States because they were imagining a world where they could pursue higher education, where they could build a family and give the life that they wanted for myself and my brother. They settled in New York, and I was born a few years later in Flushing, Queens. That's me, my second day on Earth. And if you're not aware, Flushing, Queens is one of the most ethnically diverse counties in the United States. So I had a chance to grow up in this really rich, culturally rich immigrant community. From a really young age, life consisted of Play-Doh and a lot of Pokemon. And growing up, I traveled between home and my second home in Taiwan, and I felt as though I was still connected to my family halfway around the world. By being part of an immigrant community, I cared about what was happening globally simply because of my proximity. Thinking globally became a real core part of my identity. As I grew up in this dual cultural environment, as I grew up really having this close proximity, webcam chatting my grandparents in Taiwan, sitting on my mom's lap and having these conversations, I thought that I knew what the world was. I thought that I understood global issues. It wasn't until a really powerful moment happened to me in second grade. My teacher at the time, Miss Pittman, asked the class, "What would you do if the answers to our world's toughest problems were in the mind of someone who didn't believe their voice or actions mattered?" I'm going to read that again. What would you do if the answers to our world's toughest problems were in the mind of someone who didn't believe their voice or actions mattered? And I think that's an incredibly difficult question to ask a second grader. I remember running home to my mom, absolutely flabbergasted by how I felt, how unjust it was, and feeling really flattened and powerless. It seemed almost impossible to tackle these social issues. Go ahead and drop in the chat. Press me, write me in the chat if this is something that you felt before, that you felt that the challenges that we're up against are way too challenging for us to fix. I'm seeing a lot of me's in the chat. Go ahead and throw me in the chat if this is something that you felt before, because it's something that I felt that moment, and it's something that I still feel today. But I feel incredibly lucky to have had a superhero of a mom help me find my voice. My mom's community involvement was fundamental in developing my identity as a changemaker. She showed me what social impact, what ethical community engagement meant before I even knew what those terms were. I always like to say that growing up with my mom has been the longest internship I've ever held, helping support community-based organizations that she started, a youth orchestra, a local culture academy. These are all components that really fundamentally help me understand the power that individuals have to make a difference. It fundamentally made me realize that one person could make a huge difference, and our capacity to make change grows over time. And it was with this backdrop and with this internship that I started getting really involved in youth leadership. I pursued opportunities where I could explore these interests in college. I studied the labor movement, specifically how capacity can be built in communities and how environments can be curated for everyone to see their power, for everyone to see their magic. And it's within these experiences that I became really inspired by the potential of young people. I became really inspired by the potential of young people to change the world. And I became passionate about democratizing the opportunities that I had that led me to where I am today. And now a lot of my work is focused on activating youth. And that's what brings me here to you today. It was through these experiences that I realized that the people who solve problems must somehow first arrive at the belief that they can solve problems. This belief doesn't emerge suddenly. This belief doesn't you don't just wake up and feel like you can change the world. The capacity to cause change grows in an individual over time, as small-scale efforts lead gradually to larger ones. I'm pursuing a degree in education because I believe in these efforts, and I'm committed to playing a role in creating these opportunities for young people. So I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about my work as a youth observer. As Spud mentions, I'm currently serving as the 9th U.S. Youth Observer to the United Nations. I have the great privilege of connecting young people to the work of the UN and bringing a bureaucratic institution like the UN back to young people. I like to describe my role in really 3 buckets. The first is to connect young people to the work of the UN, making sure that young people understand that this is a window to the United Nations. I do this through social media. I do this by inviting young people to UN conferences and bringing them to the decision-making tables. The second is to activate young people, activate youth. I think it's incredibly important that we give young people the tools that they need to change the world. And this last piece is really amplifying youth leadership, amplifying the good work that young people are leading all across the US, and doing that through social media, doing that through podcasts, or doing that by inviting them to the table to share their stories. And a lot of this work is guided by the Sustainable Development Goals. But before we get there, I'm going to invite us to do a quick chat wave. What is a global issue that you are passionate about? I want to hear what you're interested in. What's so amazing about seeing your global issues, seeing things that you're passionate about, is that they tie directly into the Sustainable Development Goals. In September 2015, the General Assembly, which is the main organ of the United Nations, adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and that includes the Sustainable Development Goals. Building on the principle that we're leaving no one behind, the 17 goals represent a holistic approach to achieving sustainable development for all. Within the Sustainable Development Goals, we have 17 specific goals ranging from no poverty to quality education, to reduced inequalities, to life on land. I think it's incredibly important to understand that a lot of your interests are in these Sustainable Development Goals. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals, within each one, has specific targets. So there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets that represent a universal agenda. They are integrated, they are indivisible, and balance the 3 dimensions of sustainable development, which at the United Nations are economic, social, and environmental. What's super exciting about the SDGs, what's super exciting about the Sustainable Development Goals, is that they're often referred to as the blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. And I want to pause for a moment and share that this is not just a blueprint that could be used by countries or world leaders. It can be used for you to localize social change in your communities as well. The SDGs are universal, they transcend borders, and apply across sectors and communities. And as part of this conversation, I want to invite you into a few conversations that I've had during my term. At the start of my term, I went on a listening tour. I gathered 100+ small groups across the country, and I spoke with young people on how they're feeling aligned to the SDGs, how they want to be involved in the SDGs, and any barriers that they faced in getting involved with the Sustainable Development Goals. I want to share some of the insights that I've learned during that listening tour. And the first takes me to a 2nd grade classroom in Boston, Massachusetts. I had a chance to enter a 2nd grade classroom where I learned that young people have immense wisdom. I was in the 2nd grade classroom. We asked everyone in the class to draw a picture of what they hope to see in 2030. And I had a 2nd grade student draw a picture depicting world peace. And I'm sure you can imagine the picture that she drew. It was a picture of a globe with a peace sign and people of all different shapes, sizes, and colors holding hands in harmony. I think it's incredibly important for us to invite young people into the conversation. So I asked Sarah, I asked the 2nd grader, Sarah, How are we going to make this happen? This seems like a really wild goal. How are we going to make world peace happen? And she looked at me like I had 7 heads. She looked at me like I had 7 heads and she said, Dustin, it's so easy. I'm just going to make sure that every single person in my life is kind. I'm going to make sure that everyone around me is kind. And I felt absolutely schooled by the 2nd grader. It reminded me that we need to hold on to our ethos of possibility and imagination. And I think it's really important that we recognize that young people bring the creativity, the innovation, and also the energy that we need in this moment. The second biggest takeaway that I had from my listening tour is that young people hold expertise on the SDGs. You have expertise on the SDGs. I visited a group in Jackson County, Oregon, virtually, of course. And I heard from a young activist named Andrew. And he said, hey, Dustin, sometimes it feels like you need a PhD to understand climate change. Sometimes it feels like you need a PhD or you need to finish college before you can actually make change. I said, hey, Andrew, let's stay in touch. Let me know how these thoughts evolve. That was in the summer. And unfortunately, 3 weeks later, the wildfires due to climate change impacted the West Coast. He called me back and he sent me a picture. And Andrew said, Dustin, you know, climate change is not that difficult to understand when my community is in ashes. Climate change is not that difficult to understand when I get a phone call from my best friend who says that he no longer has a house to go back to. I think it's incredibly important for us to recognize that young people understand the SDGs and are able to act on the SDGs because we see them happening in our communities every day and we're impacted by them every day. A last takeaway that I want to share with you folks is that our capacity to make change grows over time. I had a chance to meet with a young woman named Claire in Nebraska. And when she first heard about the SDGs, she got really excited about them. She said, Dustin, where do I go from this? And I said, Claire, what's your next step? What do you want to happen in your community? And she shared with me that she wanted everyone to know about the SDGs. That day, she wrote a letter to her teacher. That night, she emailed her teacher and said, hey, Ms. Watson, I think we should learn about the SDGs in school. That was in August. In November, she wrote a letter to her principal, scaling the initiative. In December, she actually met with her school board, and now the entire district is actually teaching the SDGs across the system. I think it's incredibly important for us to recognize that our ability to make change grows over time, our capacity to make change grows over time, and there are so many different ways that we can make that change. The most common question I get asked when I meet with young people is, where do I begin? How do I begin with the SDGs that can sometimes feel like they're happening halfway around the world, that there's such huge issues? Where do I begin? My best advice is that it starts by checking in with yourself. It starts by centering in. Start by choosing that super tricky global challenge that you're really passionate about. You folks have already shared some in the chat, but start by identifying that SDG. Start identifying by that global issue that you really are energized by, that you're really passionate about. The next thing that I ask young people to think about is think about your personal gifts and skills. What makes you feel like you're flying? What makes you feel like you get energy from it? What makes you feel like you're really contributing, or makes you feel like you're the best person at this in the room? What are your personal gifts and skills? And then we find ways in which they meet. Your role in the social change movement, your role in the SDGs are going to be critical to us achieving the SDGs. And I think it's important for us to understand that we often follow scripts for what youth leadership can look like, when at the end of the day, what will give us the most energy, what we will feel most passionate about, and what will really give us the momentum that we need to push forward is when we find that connection between our personal gifts and skills and those super tricky global challenges. I think about my friend, Ahmed, who is a storyteller, who has managed to insert his gift of storytelling to target the super tricky global challenge of the refugee crisis, using stories to illuminate the challenges that that population faces. I think about my friend, A.Y. Young, who's using music to allow people to understand the SDGs in a more approachable way. All roles in social change are valid. All roles in social change are valid. I think it's really important that we start understanding that it starts with us. It starts with one step. It starts from us really recognizing what we bring to this current moment, because I can guarantee you that every single one of you on this call has something to contribute for us to achieve the SDGs. All roles in social change are valid. What is something that you feel is a personal skill or gift. We've already established what your global issue is, what you're passionate about. I want us to drop in for a moment and think about what you believe your personal skill or gift is. What would the world look like if we all utilize those skills to push forward the SDGs, to make the change that we want to see, and to build the world we want to live in? So I'll end where we started, with the question, what is the world that you want to live in? And I'll share with you my answer. I want to live in a world where young people have what they need to make change. I want to live in a world where young people believe that they are problem solvers. I want to live in a world where all youth leadership is valid. And I want to live in the world where we achieve the SDGs by 2030. Thank you so much for checking in. This has been so fun to have a chance to connect with you folks. If you'd like to connect, here's my social media handle. Here's my email. I'm always happy to be a cheerleader for your work. Feel free to reach out at any time.